Hi there, my name is Kelly Cody Grimm.
And I'm Max Grimm.
And we are Creative Actors Lab. What we want to do is just talk a little bit about how you can bring creativity into your everyday life. Alrighty.
Welcome.
So, today is actually a topic that Max and I have been talking about, and it's one that a lot of times I get cast to play the mean kind of Karens just because, well, my hair's red now, but when I was blonde, I kind of fit that type. And sometimes playing bad guys can be a lot of fun. It does get a little old if you're constantly being typecast. But what we wanted to talk about is a little bit about the psychology of the villain. Did you want to go a little bit more into that?
Actually, playing villains can be ridiculously fun.
They can be fun.
My first play I ever did in college in a little studio theater production was The Shoemaker and the Devil by Anton Chekhov. Guess who I played? And the thing of it is, the thing that I think particularly for actors to come to understand about playing villains is, in order to do it and do it effectively, you have to understand why this person is so evil. Mm-hmm. Why do they do what they do? You know, if you really understand that and you come to really mete out the humanity of why somebody has made this choice to do whatever the terrible things are that they do, that's where that is a skill you need as an actor as you are developing your characters, is to come to understand their motivations and why they behave in the way that they do. Like, a lot of actors will start off playing a villain, and it's just this one level. It's like, I'm evil because I want to be. Well, there's way more to it than that. And that's a method of thinking that has really got to be involved with whatever character you create, be it a hero or a villain or whatever. You have to understand why that person does what they do. And I heard something the other day as I was researching this, and I'm kind of paraphrasing it here, but there was this one thought of a person becomes either a hero or a villain by how they respond to pain and trauma.
Mm-hmm. That's really good.
And, and it's like you have someone, Scar in The Lion King. The reason Scar became this villain is because he went to save his pride, got this big scar over one eye, and then Mufasa, his brother, was making fun of him for having the scar. He's like, yeah, but I got it because I was saving our families, our community. And just to be mindlessly made fun of in that way is what, if I'm going to be treated that way, well, then I'm going to respond accordingly. One of the things I worked on in school a lot was Richard III. And in the opening monologue, Richard III, if you're not familiar, he is a real bad guy. And the whole opening of the play, Act 1, Scene 1, and Now is the Winter of Our Discontent, Made Glorious Summer by the Son of York, and you, in that, he basically is having a moment with the audience to where he comes to the conscious decision of, I have gone out and I have done all these good things for my people. I have saved them from invasion. I have saved them from rape and tyranny and pillaging and all these other horrible things. But Richard was born with these deformities, and he, in spite of him doing all these good things for his people, he is still made fun of and mocked and scorned because of his physical deformity. Has a club foot, a hunchback, and things like that. And basically says, if this is how I'm going to be treated, then I'm going to respond accordingly, and I'm going to be a villain. It's just, in that speech, he points out so beautifully and eloquently, this is what I've done, and this is how I've been treated, and this is how I live my life, and just everybody has treated me like garbage. Okay, fine, then you're going to get what you pay for here. Mm-hmm. If you look at quote-unquote villains from, even from Shakespeare and prior to that, and then even up to now, and some of my personal favorite villains of the modern era, like from Breaking Bad, from The Walking Dead and stuff like that, it still follows the same thing of these people became these villains because something happened to them that traumatized them, and this is how they respond to it. It's like, to sort of switch it around, you take like the young Bruce Wayne. And Batman, let's just say Bruce Wayne and Batman, that guy's got issues. He is not wired up right, and it's because the young Bruce Wayne saw both of his parents be shot and murdered right in front of him, and that is an extreme trauma that he's carrying with him for the rest of his life. And so he makes the decision to deal with that trauma by being Batman, by being this hero. It could have just as easily have turned around and it's like, well, this terrible thing happened to me, so I'm going to be the Joker. Someone
exactly.
like the Joker was traumatized by falling into this vat of chemistry, and it bleached his skin, it did all this stuff to him. With that trauma, that's when he decides, like, okay, I'm going to put the pedal to the metal and I'm going to be a real bad guy. Mm-hmm. One of the ways of thinking of this is what happened to your character. And you and take it even out of the context of acting. You start looking at people in like true crime stories, people that that just have these personality quirks to where it's like they wake up in the morning, it seems like they make the conscious decision of, I'm going to be a real bad person today. What happened to them? What traumatized them? What hurt them? And how are they responding to it? And it's that's where the whole thing of villainy starts from there.
Oh, I absolutely agree. I will chime in something very interesting I learned on another podcast called Lore, Aaron Mankey, and he actually had talked about Sanctuary, and that Richard III's, I believe his brother's wife, Queen Anne, or Lady Anne, had to go into Westminster Abbey with her daughters and 2 sons. And then there was a point where Richard III had put them all up in the Tower of London, I believe, and you never saw the 2 sons again. And then recently, 100 years ago, they discovered the bones of 2 young boys that kind of fit the description. So when you're talking about, well, villain or whatever, but I'm like, if he had, but Lady Anne and her daughters ended up living, and they ended up going back into Westminster because you could get Sanctuary and you couldn't go in there. But I thought that was really interesting, and apparently Westminster is not going to let them exhume so that they can do DNAs, because they've got like 3,000 people buried there. I think you could probably do a whole podcast just based on Westminster and all the people that are buried there, but they don't want, obviously, people exhuming everybody who's buried there. But I happened to think of that as you were talking about Richard III, because if you're offing your 9-year-old and your 12-year-old nephews, you ain't a good guy. I don't care whatever your motivation is. But yeah, when you're talking about, damaged villains, and I want to talk about a female villain, well, although I guess she would be a villain, but we've got Annie Wilkes from Stephen King's Misery by Kathy Bates.
Okay.
And she is a lonely, obsessive person. She's a nurse. I really didn't go too deep into Nurse Ratched. She's also, Nurse Ratched plays One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, a very interesting villain. But yeah, she's obsessive, she's lonely, and I really think she could have been one-noted, but the way that Kathy Bates played her, you just see that this is a being that is so hurt, and she is just lives for these romance novels, and for her to have found the author, on the snow, you wonder if she was kind of responsible for his accident, took care of him. And then I love that she does not curse. Her biggest curse word is cock-a-doodle. So she has these little quirks, just the fact that she keeps on saying to him, I'm your biggest fan, is, I think, really quite brilliant. And, again, so we'll talk a little bit about One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Nurse Ratched, she tries to keep everybody in this mental ward under her thumb, and she does it in very terrible, terrible ways. You don't get too much into her backstory, but you gotta wonder, what is it that happened to her that made her such a control freak? So again, and Louise Fletcher and Kathy Bates both won Oscars for playing those 2 female villains. So rather than just saying, I'm going to be bad, cock-a-doodle, or I'm going to be bad because I am a nurse and I want to be evil, there's these levels. in some villains, there's that level of flamboyance, but then what happens is when they get quieter, they're scarier.
Yeah.
So they may kill people in a flamboyant way, but their outward appearance isn't so much. And I know one of your favorite villains is Hannibal Lecter.
Oh, yeah.
Do you want to talk about him?
You know, that's a character. He's been played by so many great actors.
Yeah.
One thing I remember when I saw The Silence of the Lambs when it came out in theaters back in, I guess, 90, 91 or 92 or something like that. And, you know, I remember hearing Anthony Hopkins saying that he wanted his appearance to be very slicked back and streamlined because he was a very efficient killing machine. And there came a point in the movie, I'll never forget this. All the movies I've ever seen, I will never forget this moment of police take Hannibal Lecter out, and he's bound, and he's on this like furniture mover dolly type of thing, and he's got the steel mask on, and he's got the straps and the whole thing, and he's talking to this senator whose daughter has been kidnapped by Buffalo Bill. So they're trying to get, you know, information from Hannibal Lecter about, you know, what are Buffalo Bill's motives and his modus operandi and so forth. And even though he's bound from head to foot and he's got, you know, armed guards on him and everything like that, I'll never forget this one scene that one of the guards accidentally drops a pen and does not realize it. And you sort of see this pen drop through the air in slow motion, and it hits the ground, and then you have this close-up of Hannibal Lecter and just his eyes looking at the pen. The entire movie theater screamed at a pen dropping. And that, by the way, is one of the two things I've come to observe, that actors playing villains, it's two tools: the eyes, particularly on camera, but in general, the eyes and the voice. I'll just go off on this for a second about the Walking Dead. And I know there are people
and
out there.
I'll get back to Hannibal when you're done.
But there's people who have got very, very, very strong opinions about The Walking Dead, one way or the other. So I don't mean to enter into that debate, but I will say this. You know, you had the character of the governor. You know, he had severed heads in an aquarium, and he would sit there and listen to Mozart and sip his whiskey and you know, and look at all this severed head and all this extravagant stuff. But the actor that portrayed him, he never, you know, was wringing his hands and laughing maniacally and twisting his mustache. And there was none of that stuff. Everything was very, very subtle. One thing is, like, you knew with that character when things were going to get really bad, somebody would say something that would just trigger him, and he would go, and just that was kind of, oh God, here we go. And then, sure enough, there'd be all this blood and guts and terror and carnage and all that would go along. And he was just terrifying. And I remember seeing the character being, or the actor rather, being interviewed, and the audience was afraid to applaud for the actor. It's like, what's going to set him off? That's powerful. That's really, really powerful. And you had that character versus the character of Negan, who a lot of fans of that show, of which I was one, really, that's when the show really lost me. Because the thing about Negan, and this is no slam on the actor, I think this is how he was directed, you know, everything with the character of Negan was very over the top and very screaming and yelling and getting in people's face and being weird and all of that. One leveled, one noted performance. Because and I pretty much left the show. David Morrissey, thank you very much. David Morrissey as the governor. It's like, kind of with the character of Negan, or at least as much as I saw it, was like you knew what was going to happen. There were no particular levels to it. You didn't. I think you eventually did come to see his humanity and his backstory and why he came into it. But he just, you know, everything for so long was just this: I'm terrible and I'm evil and I'm, you know, and I'm just this nightmare incarnate. To me, the juxtaposition of the two characters, you had the governor who could be really charming, could be very eloquent, could, you could almost get to like the guy, and then all of a sudden, like, something sets him off, something triggers him, and then all of a sudden here comes all of this murder and carnage and bloodshed. With the character of Negan, there was just a lot of histrionics and hyperbole and all of that, whereas with the governor, things could be so subtle. And the thing about that is that as you get, and I'm doing this intentionally right now, but you get an actor and they're performing something and their voice gets really soft and they get really calm, and they just sort of take on this tone to their voice. And what happens is that the audience, you as an audience member, you start physically getting dragged into it. You'll even see people in audiences, when the actor starts doing something like that with their voice, they'll physically start leaning in to get a better idea of what of what is this person talking about. And then once you get them in that close, then it's like the snake just reaches out and strikes. Mm-hmm. And that's one of those techniques in playing villains, is mechanisms, those things that really make playing the villain really effective and really, really fun, and how you can just psychologically just manipulate and maneuver the audience with the eyes, with the voice.
And I'll circle back to Hannibal Lecter and where so many of the actors that had played him, but particularly Anthony Hopkins. Mm-hmm. Most people know Anthony Hopkins the best. He had, when he walks in and he just sees Jodie Foster's character, and the first thing he says is, "Hello, Clarice." Mm-hmm. And you're like, huh? He can't be. That's just really, just from the softness, from how he looks, there's a disconnect there. A little bit on the history of him. He is a forensic psychologist, so again, he knows how to play people's psyche, and that's, again, what makes him a little deadly. One thing I thought was interesting researching him, he's offended by rudeness. Mm-hmm. So you could see where there would be triggers there. If you're going to be rude to someone else or him and you show a lack of respect, you are going to pay for that. He did torture animals as a child, so that is frequently a hallmark of serial killers and people like that. But he did see his sister murdered and then cannibalized. So yeah, that's gonna leave a mark.
Yeah,
sadly, on him. But it's just, when you know that backstory, maybe you have a little sympathy for him. But for him to be able to go in and use his forensic psychology as a way to gain people's trust and then kill them, I think is just, that adds an extra layer of maniacal, in my opinion. So again, I am a science fiction geek, so I'm going to talk about a very complicated villain of Darth Vader.
Actually, let me say one thing before you go on to that.
Sure.
Just, the whole thing about the first time you see Hannibal Lecter in the Silence of the Lambs, you have Clarice, she walks into that part of the prison where you have all the real serious, oh my God, crazy, maniacal, terrible people, and she's walking down this corridor in the prison, and these depraved, horrible inmates are saying all this stuff to her and behaving in all these ways, and she finally gets to Hannibal Lecter, and he's just standing in his cell very calmly. It's like, and basically it's like, I'm home, I'm with my people. And he's got this ease about him and just this eloquence about him. And that's the first time you see him in the middle of all this stuff, and rather than, jumping up and down and climbing the walls and laughing maniacally and wringing his hands and all, he's just like, oh, hello, welcome to my home. And that's the first time you see that, and that to me really, really sets the tone. But anyway, carry on.
Yeah, definitely. So, again, it's that unexpected, and the thing is Darth Vader, he's Anakin Skywalker. He's really Luke Skywalker's father. We find that out in the course of the original Star Wars movies. I'm going to age myself. I saw the original one when it came out in 1977, and people were like going, what? You mean that's not really Carrie Fisher? That's like she's being projected in there? And that was just kind of pretty crazy as far as that went. And you get the flavors of who he is, interestingly enough, because they felt like Darth Vader didn't say a whole lot. You just had the... James Earl Jones wasn't sure he wanted to be credited with the voice in the very first movie, and then they expanded on him. And just the idea of Darth Vader, George Lucas played with the idea of a Dark Vader. So it was just kind of interesting. Different languages usually make him Dark Vader rather than Darth, but you can see where that was. And he in theory was one of the greatest pupils of Obi-Wan Kenobi and the Jedi, which is a very mind-based, almost like Buddhist, if you were going to try to compare, peaceful, loving, the way of the Jedi would be very much the way of the Dalai Lama and the Buddhists.
It's got a very Zen-like quality to it.
Exactly. So the fact that this guy just decided that he was going to go over to the dark side, he ends up having an affair with Padme. And then from there, there's Princess Leia, but then there's also Luke Skywalker. And then, just the fact that he becomes so cold-blooded, and then he gets lured to the dark side because, again, he was supposed to have been the greatest Jedi of all, and eventually his son becomes that. But what is interesting with him, unlike a lot of the others, he does try to redeem himself at the end. He saves his son Luke. Mm-hmm. So he hadn't been completely consumed by the dark side, but I just think it's very interesting. So you had, not just Darth Vader, who is this villain. So now you've got Anakin Skywalker, you've got his whole backstory and everything that happened. But, a lot of people would point to that. But I do think what is interesting, unlike some of these other villains, towards the end, he had to have that redemption. He had to save his son. There was still that goodness in him that made him want to be a better person, even though he was behind the mask. And and when he had his fight with Obi-Wan, a little bit like the Joker fell into acid. Mm-hmm. And then that's what scarred his face. That's why his lung, he had to have the breathing apparatus. So I think all that is just very, very interesting. Just as far as villains go. So he tried to be good. He was supposed to be good. He went bad. And then the very last thing in his life that he does is save his son. So there's always redemption. I think that's what makes it interesting for villains. Will they try to redeem themselves? Many times they don't. But when they do, it's a nice story arc.
Well, it also seems, in terms of story arcs, that there comes a point with a lot of villains in the telling of their story, is that what happens is that they may not be doing real good in the first place. They may be involved in some kind of petty crime or some kind of underhanded stuff or whatever, but there's still redemption. Mm-hmm. Then it seems like something will happen, and this is the moment where it seems like, okay, they just turn down a road that they're never really going to be able to turn back. And it's like they could have been redeemed, could have something happened, and then he got into the fight with Batman, fell off of this catwalk into this vat of chemical waste or whatever it was. Then he's revealed to look in a mirror, and he sees his face, and then it's like that's the moment that it all turned down a road that it seems like there's really no turning back from.
In some of these characters, though, and this was brought up by when we were talking about this, and one of our students, Adam Slaughter, was talking about, for a lot of villains, there is a level of flamboyance. Mm-hmm. It's, and you see that so much with the DC and even Marvel villains.
Oh, yeah.
Is my calling card is I am fabulous. Mm-hmm. Not necessarily that way, but it's like the Riddler. Riddle me this. Mm-hmm. And the Joker's got his, way of doing things and laughing as, a hospital's blowing up behind him. You even see that, with Darth Vader, because he's got the costume, he's got the cape, he's got all that, he is able to make people think and do things differently because he has the ability of the Force, so he can bend weak minds. That's just really interesting. So there is this sense of you haven't treated me right. You're going to know me. You are going to fear me, and you are going to fear me in new ways. I'm going to find a new and unique way for you to fear me.
They've all got their definite modus operandi. They've all got their idiosyncrasies.
Yes.
And that's how the police or the authorities come to start, profiling them and think about what are they going to do next. And it's because of these eccentricities that makes villains interesting. The Riddler had some kind of a psychological block to where it's like he could not do anything without sending out these riddles. He just couldn't do things any other way.
Well, Norman Bates might, if you know his backstory, when you're talking about anti-heroes, just he's been portrayed a few ways, but he seems nice and unassuming.
Yeah.
The guy had mommy issues.
A little bit.
A little bit. We'd like to, and when we're talking about flamboyance, he seems very ordinary. When you very first see him in Psycho, he's just like, hey, it's not much here. Can I get you a little sandwich or something? He seems like a super nice guy. But, again, Bates Motel, it's literally off the beaten path. She's there by herself. It should have been, hey, you're here with this guy. He seems nice. You really need to go down the road and find, a Days Inn or something like that. She didn't, but, again, she's running because she has just stolen money from her employer. That he goes up to the house, and then you hear him, Norman? Mother, stop it. Norman, she's a whore. Any girl that's not me is a whore, which is what he heard in his childhood, which is what turned that light on to any woman I'm attracted to isn't a whore. I'm going to be unfaithful to my mother, therefore I have to kill them. So, there's been a lot of iterations. One that was, fairly recent, which was Bates Motel, where you do get to see more, very much the backstory of actually Norma and Norman. I do think it is interesting that she named him Norman and her name was Norma. So we're not naming him after. And the fact that in some stories you do have Norman actually killing his abusive father. So we got mommy issues and we killed her daddy. So there's nothing Oedipus-like with that at all.
Yeah, no, and just also being as isolated as the character of Norman is.
Yes.
Is in the movie, if I'm remembering correctly, it's like they, at some point, the people that build roads put a highway in, and the Bates Motel would have all of this, kind of foot traffic, and and then suddenly the highway got diverted, and he's pretty much out by himself, alone with his tortured thoughts, becomes this, idle hands are the devil's workshop phenomenon.
And if Marion had just gone down the road to go to the diner, she would have seen that there was, it wasn't that far away. Then there's the 4 words or the 6 words that can change everything for you kids that like The Incredibles.
One of my favorite movies, by the way.
Yes.
All time, one of my absolute favorite movies was The Incredibles for a variety of reasons. But anyway. Because
I think just for our childhood, it feels very much like The Jetsons. It's kind of set in that comic book
It's got that idea, yeah.
So you have Buddy very much in the same vein as Annie Wilkes. He is Mr. Incredible's biggest fan. In fact, he even says that. So we do have that little bit of a connection. I'm your biggest fan. So he has all these contraptions like any good superhero is going to do, like Batman. He doesn't have superpowers, but he has a ton of contraptions. So Buddy's going that.
He's got rocket boots. He's got force fields. He's got science.
And he just wants to help the world, and he wants to help Mr. Incredible. They're trying to stop this arsonist. So they're going in, and Buddy's inventions go all haywire. The bad guy gets away. I think he's a mime. I forget now what his name is. Yeah. So then at that point, Mr. Incredible's upset because he's also supposed to get married to Elastigirl, and so he's going to be late for that. There's just a lot of things going on. Buddy just picked the wrong day to try to help. But the 6 words that changed his life were, fly home, Buddy, I work alone.
Yeah.
And at that point, he decided, again, when we're talking the theme of this, it's good to be, if I can't be good, I'm going to be bad. And I am going to be the baddest badass they've ever seen. I'm going to start picking off heroes.
Yeah.
What is just very interesting was I think villains, they don't come into this world to be bad people. They want to be good people. Scar and Buddy. And then things just go terribly, terribly wrong.
Yeah, well, well, the thing about Buddy also is that when that occurrence happens, I mean, he's very much in his formative youth, and it was just one of those little things that maybe had that been said to him at a different point in his life, maybe Buddy would not have become Syndrome. It's I think also timing plays a great part in the making of a villain. Just like not just what happened to them, but when it happened to them.
Exactly. Yeah, so to your point, and that's actually a really good segue into anti-heroes.
All right, I got it. This was not a show for everybody. Breaking Bad.
Oh, brilliant show.
Some people, like myself, were huge fans of that show. Other people, it was not a show for everybody. But when you look at the character of Walter White and how his character arc went over, I guess, the 5 or 6 seasons of Breaking Bad, he went from being this lovable schlub. He was this beloved high school chemistry teacher. He had a wife. They had
Let's talk about science.
And then all of a sudden, a baby on the way, and they're in their late 40s or something, and they don't have a lot of money. Then all of a sudden, this guy who's just trying to do the right thing and just be a good teacher and be a good husband and a good father and just a good guy, he gets diagnosed with cancer, and it's going to be really bad. The first thing he thinks to himself is, how am I going to take care of my family when I'm not going to be here anymore? And so just by this series of accidents, series of random occurrences, he winds up realizing that he can cook methamphetamine and do it better than anybody else. And he has this young student with him. It's kind of like you have the character of Walter White, but then you've got Jesse Pinkman, and it's the same sort of an idea of Walter White is like King Lear and Jesse is like his fool.
I would not have thought of it, but yeah, you can totally see that if you know King Lear.
But, and basically he's, Walter White, he's just trying to take care of his family. It's kind of like, well, I'm not going to be here in a year or 18 months or whatever. And then there's going to come a point where it's like, he's not going to, he's going to be in such bad physical health. He's not going to be able to do anything. So just this opportunity gets presented to him of, I start cooking this methamphetamine, and then all of the stuff and the people that and the really dark people that he gets into, one of which you see early on. Talk about another villain, Tuco Salamanca. That character was nuts.
Yeah,
that character was driven insane by methamphetamine. You look at the story arc of Walter White turning into Heisenberg, and just all of the brutality that just sort of came about. And I think if you know the show and you watched every episode, I think I've watched the show probably like from beginning to end like 3 times through at this point. In my opinion, there is where Walter really went down this irretrievable path is when he realized that the cartel, like the opposition forces of the cartel, were going to start, going after his wife and child and his son and the baby. He basically goes to the house and he's like, we've got to get out of here.
You don't think it was the plane crash where he allowed Jesse's girlfriend to die? And
no,
that was an unintended consequence.
That was an unintended thing. To me, where I think it really got cemented was he goes back to the house and he says, we've got to get out of here. Just pack your stuff. We've got to leave. And Skylar, his wife, and they get into this big brouhaha, and she's feeling very threatened, and she pulls out, and they get into this fight. She pulls out a kitchen knife and slices him across the hand. That's where he loses it, and he's like, we don't behave like this. We are a family. We don't do this. the whole physical altercation between Walter and Skylar leaves the house, goes out the front yard and into the middle of the street, and you have Walter Jr., the son, on crutches with cerebral palsy, getting between his mother and father, trying to keep his father away from his mother, who's still like waving a kitchen knife around. That to me is where it just went down to this, like, there's no turning back at this point. That's another one of the elements of how a villain becomes a villain. How did they respond to pain and trauma? And then they started behaving in a certain way, then in doing certain things in certain ways. Then it got to a point where it just, whatever series of steps they took, it came to this like one instance to where it's like, okay, this is pretty much an irretrievable circumstance.
There's the point of no return.
Exactly.
And if you are like a screenwriter and you look at the beat sheets for Save the Cat, there's the point, all is lost. There is that point of no return. You've got to make that decision, and the character has to change.
Yep.
So I think those are just some of our favorite villains. And, again, as we said at the beginning, it's good to be bad. It's fun to play villains and to find those layers. Again, if all you're going to do is go, I'm evil, and I'm going to twist my mustache and do bad things, when you can see it in the eyes and the face that there might be, and you didn't even discuss Gus Fring.
That's a whole podcast.
That's a whole yeah, he is so good.
But I wanted to add one thing. This is not an actor-based thing. There's a guy that I started listening to, a guy by the name of Nick Yaris, and he, when in his youth, some couple of terrible things really happened to him, and he went off on this life of crime. And he did some bad things, but basically he was wrongfully imprisoned for a rape and murder that he did not commit. And he spent 23 years on death row. And they eventually got DNA evidence, and he got out, thankfully. And the guy is out now, and he speaks at universities and all this sort of a thing. But he was on death row for 23 years, and his story is as horrendous and heart-rending as you could ever possibly imagine. But in the interview I said about him, what was said to him is, how in all that time, in all his 23 years being in that environment, literally being tortured, literally being around real actual murderers and rapists and people like that, how is it that you have come out of this and you're trying to do some good for the world? And his answer was, because I never allowed anyone to steal my kindness. And that's how I didn't turn into one of them.
And I think that's a great segue. So this episode's It's Good to Be Bad, but then we're looking at good guys and possibly anti-heroes where it would be bad to be bland. So, he made that conscious choice that I am not going to go down there, and I could. And there'd be any number of people who'd go, dude, you are justified. You had those decades of your life stolen for no good reason other than you in the wrong place at the wrong time. Tobias Tubbs also has a very similar story. He got out, he also does a podcast that's, on the Good News Network. So, when you hear those stories, it's like, man, that the level of character there is just amazing. But anyway, and when we talk about being more creative, I'm going to give you guys some creative prompts. If you were going to create a supervillain, what sort of things would you want that villain to have? Just for yourself, whether you're writing it down on a piece of paper, you want to journal as that character. That's kind of fun. What kind of food would that character like? Does that character draw? Or you could just draw a picture of what you think they are. But that can just be something kind of fun to explore if you were going to create this universe or just this little tiny world or just this little character. What would they look like? What sort of life experience would they have? What sort of things would make them unique as a villain?
And something you may want to consider, just as one of the finer points of that, is if you have this villain and they went to jail and they were going to go on death row, what would their last meal be? Would it be steak and lobster and champagne? Would it be burgers and fries?
Grilled cheese and tomato soup?
There was actually studies done about these different killers. So they were having their last meal. Somebody wanted Big Macs and fries. Somebody else wanted wine and cheese.
again, we talked about Gus Fring, of all the things he ran.
Los Pollos Hermanos. The Chicken Brothers.
Yeah.
I suppose he made some of the best fried chicken in Albuquerque.
So, that was his thing. He was a bad guy, had a meth lab underneath his restaurant, but dang, he was turning out some good product.
Yeah.
And you better make sure you got the fryer cleaned correctly. But anyway, again, it's just those dichotomies that I think make villains very interesting. But anyway, thank you guys so much for spending time with us and learning why it's good to be bad. Check back with us next week where we talk about heroes, anti-heroes, and why it's bad to be bland. Thanks so much.
Much love, everybody. Be well until next time.
We appreciate you guys tuning in, and keep in mind that you can catch us on our social media, Creative Actors Lab on Instagram and Facebook, and by the same name on YouTube. And for more on what we do, you can go to our website,
creativeactorslab.com, all one word. Thank you for listening. Stay curious, make art, not war. Much love until next time.